In the deepest places of the galaxy, where the Emperor's light has never touched, and hope itself has withered to nothing more than a child's forgotten prayer, there exists a darkness that moves with purpose. It is not the darkness of empty space or abandoned worlds, but something far more terrible, the darkness of human will, refined into its purest, most predatory form. This is the story of what it means to be a Night Lord, hunting in the shadows of a galaxy that has forgotten how to scream. The underhive of Tertius Prime stretches beneath the planet's surface like the root system of some vast metallic tree. Kilometers upon kilometers of corroded pipework, abandoned hab blocks, and forgotten machinery create a three-dimensional labyrinth where millions of souls eke out their existence in perpetual twilight. The air itself is poisonous, a cocktail of industrial runoff, human waste, and the sweet stench of decay that permeates every surface. Here, where the Imperium's grand rhetoric about human dignity dissolves into the reality of survival at any cost, something inhuman has made its home. His name, if name still held meaning for creatures such as he, was once spoken with the accent of Nostromo's crime-riddled streets. Now it exists only as a whispered curse in the deepest reaches of the underhive, syllables that children dare not speak aloud lest they summon the very darkness they fear. But names are for humans, and what stalks these corridors transcended humanity long ago. He is simply the hunter, the shadow, the thing that waits in the spaces between the failing lumens. The transformation began, as all damnation must, with choice. On Nostromo, that world of eternal night and casual cruelty, he had been merely another street predator, quick with a blade, quicker with his feet, and blessed with that particular kind of cunning that keeps children alive in places where childhood itself is a luxury few can afford. When the recruiters came, seeking new flesh for the 7 Legions ranks, he had not run as the others did. Instead, he had walked forward into the darkness, drawn by something deeper than ambition or fear. Perhaps even then, some part of him recognized what he was destined to become. The trials that followed would have broken lesser minds. In the absolute darkness of Nostromo's deepest caverns, he hunted his fellow aspirants with nothing but his enhanced senses and a growing understanding that mercy was not merely weakness, it was an evolutionary dead end. One by one, the other candidates fell to his blades or his traps, and with each death, something vital within him withered. By the time he emerged, blood-soaked and victorious, the child who had entered the caverns no longer existed. In his place stood something that wore a human face, but thought with the cold logic of an apex predator. The gene seed of Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter, brought with it gifts that lesser Astartes could never comprehend, enhanced night vision that turned absolute darkness into a hunting ground, reflexes honed to supernatural sharpness, strength and speed that made him a living weapon, but these were merely the tools. The true transformation came from within. The hypno-indoctrination that followed imprinted upon his consciousness the fundamental truth of the 8th Legion. Terror was not a byproduct of war, but its most refined expression. Fear was not an emotion to be overcome, but a weapon to be wielded with surgical precision. Under the direct tutelage of his Primarch, he learned to read human psychology like others read tactical reports. The way a victim's breathing changed in the moments before death, the precise angle at which to display a corpse to maximize psychological impact, the art of keeping prey alive just long enough to serve as a warning to others. These were not lessons in cruelty for its own sake, but studies in efficiency, how to break the will of entire populations with the death of a few carefully chosen. Examples. Konrad Curze taught his sons that they were not merely warriors, but instruments of cosmic justice. In a galaxy where law had become a joke, and order existed only at the point of a gun, someone had to remind humanity of the consequences of chaos. If civilizations would not police themselves, then monsters like the Night Lords would do it for them. It was a philosophy that transformed butchery into righteousness, cruelty into necessity. And he, like his brothers, embraced it with the fervor of a true believer. The years that followed were a masterclass in applied terror. World after world fell not to the might of the 8 Legions' weapons, but to the stories that preceded them. Populations would surrender at the mere sight of midnight blue ceramite, knowing that resistance meant not just death, but an artistically elaborate death that would serve as entertainment for creatures that had forgotten the meaning of mercy. He participated in campaigns where entire planetary governments collapsed because their leaders found the flensed corpses of their children hanging in their personal chambers, arranged with the meticulous care of a master artist. But even before the Horus heresy tore the galaxy apart, cracks had begun to show in the Night Lord's philosophy. The line between justice and sadism became increasingly blurred as the Legion's methods grew more extreme. What had begun as targeted terror tactics evolved into wholesale slaughter, campaigns of extermination that served no tactical purpose beyond satisfying the growing bloodlust of warriors who had stared too long into the abyss. When Konrad Curze himself began to succumb to the madness that his own methods had fostered, his sons found themselves adrift in a galaxy that suddenly seemed to have no place for monsters with conscience. The heresy provided a convenient excuse for what the Night Lords had already become. When loyalties shattered and brother fought brother, they simply continued doing what they had always done, bringing terror to those who had forgotten the price of order. Some fought for Horus, some remained nominally loyal to the Emperor, but most simply fought for themselves, using the chaos of civil war as cover for increasingly elaborate displays of cruelty. In the aftermath, when the dust settled and the Imperium counted its wounds, the Night Lords found themselves scattered across the galaxy like seeds of darkness. Some gathered into warbands, pirate fleets that preyed upon shipping lanes and isolated worlds. Others, like our hunter, chose a different path, embedding themselves deep within Imperial space, creating terror cells that could operate for decades without detection. The underhive of Tertius Prime offered everything a Night Lord could desire: a population too numerous to properly monitor, authorities too corrupt to investigate unusual disappearances, and an environment so hostile that his presence would initially go unnoticed among the usual hazards of underhive life. When he first descended into those polluted depths, the gangs that controlled the territory saw him as just another threat to be eliminated or co-opted. They could not have been more wrong. His first kills were masterpieces of psychological warfare. The Crimson Skulls, a gang that had controlled the eastern manufacturing sectors for over a century, discovered their leader's corpse hanging upside down from the main ventilation shaft, his skin carefully removed in a single, unbroken piece and hung beside him like a grotesque flag. The message was clear. New management had arrived. When the Skulls sent their enforcers to investigate, they found them 3 days later, arranged in a tableau that told the story of their own deaths in excruciating detail. The gang dissolved within a week, its surviving members fleeing to other sectors or simply disappearing into the underhive's endless tunnels. But wholesale slaughter was never the point. Terror, properly applied, was far more efficient than simple violence. The hunter understood that the death of one carefully chosen victim could control the behavior of thousands, that the right display of cruelty could prevent more violence than any number of threats. He began to study the underhive's social ecosystem with the patience of a natural philosopher, mapping relationships, hierarchies, and pressure points with scientific precision. The bone merchants learned the price of trafficking in slave children when their entire leadership was found arranged around a hab-block courtyard, their bodies posed as if engaged in their final business transaction, except that the merchandise on display was their own internal organs, carefully extracted and priced according to their black market value. The Iron Wolves discovered the futility of resistance when their champion, a massive brute who had never lost a pit fight, was found suspended in their own arena, slowly flensed alive over what the forensic evidence suggested had been a period of several days. His screams, according to witnesses, had been audible throughout the sector until his vocal cords finally gave out. Each death served multiple purposes. The immediate goal was always the elimination of a specific threat or the dissolution of a particular power structure. But the deeper purpose was educational, teaching the underhive's population that certain behaviors came with consequences that transcended anything the Imperial authorities might threaten. Slowly, over months and years, the hunter reshaped the underhive's criminal ecosystem through selective predation, creating a new kind of order based not on law or mutual agreement, but on the fundamental understanding that something inhuman watched from the shadows. The authorities in the upper hive initially dismissed the changes as gang consolidation, a natural evolution, as weaker groups were absorbed or eliminated by stronger ones. Crime statistics showed a dramatic decrease in violent incidents, which was interpreted as a positive development requiring no investigation. The few reports that mentioned unusual circumstances, bodies found in impossible locations, crime scenes that resembled art installations more than murder sites. Witnesses who spoke of glimpses of power-armored figures in the deep tunnels were filed away and forgotten. The upper hive had its own problems, and as long as the underhive remained relatively quiet, the specifics of how that quiet was maintained were of little concern. This willful blindness suited the hunter perfectly. Operating in the shadows required not just stealth, but the complicity of those who chose not to look too closely at what lurked in the darkness. The Imperium's bureaucratic indifference became his greatest ally, providing cover for activities that might have drawn unwanted attention in a more vigilant society. He established a network of informants among the underhive's survivor population, not through bribery or coercion, but through the simple expedient of allowing certain individuals to live in exchange for useful information. These were not willing collaborators, but broken souls who understood that their continued existence depended upon their usefulness to something that existed beyond human categories of ally or enemy. His lair, if such a mundane term could be applied to the domain of a creature like the hunter, occupied a section of the underhive that had been abandoned even by underhive standards. Deep in the industrial maze where the planet's original geothermal taps had been sunk, miles below the surface, a complex of maintenance tunnels and equipment chambers provided both security and symbolic appropriateness. Here, surrounded by the slowly cooling machinery that had once powered Tertius Prime's growth, he created a space that reflected his nature, part museum, part workshop, part shrine to the art of terror. The walls were decorated with trophies taken from his most significant kills. Not mere skulls or bones, but more elaborate mementos. The preserved face of a gang leader who had thought himself untouchable, mounted and positioned to watch over the hunter's weapon maintenance area. The hands of a corrupt enforcer who had taken bribes to ignore certain disappearances, carefully articulated and arranged to hold tools and ammunition. The vocal cords of an underhive preacher who had dared to speak of hope and redemption, stretched and displayed like the strings of some obscene musical instrument. But these were not random souvenirs of violence. Each trophy told a story, served as a reminder of lessons learned and techniques perfected. The hunter studied them during the long periods between hunts, analyzing his past work with the dispassionate eye of a craftsman, refining his art. What had worked? What could be improved? How could the message be made clearer, the terror more precisely targeted? This was not madness, despite what lesser minds might assume, but methodology, the scientific approach to fear that had been drilled into him during his transformation from street predator to Astartes monster. The daily routine of terror required meticulous preparation. Each hunt began with intelligence, gathering surveillance of potential targets, analysis of their relationships and vulnerabilities, identification of the optimal method, and timing for their elimination. The hunter had access to surveillance feeds from throughout the underhive, either through his network of informants or by direct tapping of the corroded data cables that still carried information between the various monitoring stations. He studied these feeds with the patience of a scholar, building detailed psychological profiles of his intended victims. The selection process followed criteria that would have been familiar to any student of the 8 Legions tactical doctrine. Primary targets were those whose deaths would create maximum disruption to existing power structures. Secondary targets served educational purposes, examples that would reinforce the lessons taught by primary eliminations. Tertiary targets were chosen for their symbolic value, deaths that would resonate throughout the underhive's collective unconscious and strengthen the mythology that the hunter was carefully constructing around his activities. But beyond the tactical considerations lay a deeper psychology, one that even the hunter himself did not fully understand. The need to hunt, to kill, to inspire terror, these were not merely professional obligations, but compulsions that had been hardwired into his enhanced neurology. The gene seed of Konrad Curze carried with it more than physical modifications. It transmitted psychological imperatives that shaped thought and behavior in ways that no amount of conscious will could entirely override. He was, in the most literal sense, driven by forces beyond his control to become what his Primarch had intended, a perfect predator designed for a galaxy that had forgotten how to fear. The selection of weapons for each hunt was a ritual in itself, each tool chosen not merely for efficiency, but for symbolic appropriateness. The chainsword, its teeth lovingly maintained, and its machine spirit appeased with regular offerings of blood for those whose deaths needed to be heard as well as seen. The power knife, its disruption field, capable of cutting through ceramite and bone with equal ease for work that required precision rather than spectacle. The bolt pistol, loaded with custom ammunition designed to leave distinctive wound patterns for those rare occasions when distance killing was required. But the hunter's most effective weapons were not forged of metal or powered by plasma cells. Fear itself was his primary armament, deployed with surgical precision to achieve effects that no conventional weapon could match. The carefully positioned corpse that would be discovered at exactly the right moment. The whispered threat, delivered through channels that ensured maximum propagation through the underhive's rumor networks. The glimpse of midnight blue ceramite in peripheral vision, just enough to confirm the watcher's worst suspicions without providing enough detail for accurate reporting. Each hunt followed its own rhythm, but certain elements remained constant. The approach, conducted in absolute silence through passages known only to the hunter and his network of informants. The observation period, during which the target's routine would be analyzed and vulnerabilities identified. The isolation phase, when the target would be separated from potential allies or witnesses through methods that appeared coincidental but were actually the result of careful manipulation. And finally, the strike itself, swift, brutal, and invariably more elaborate than simple murder required. The aftermath of each kill was as important as the death itself. The positioning of the corpse, the arrangement of evidence, the timing of discovery, all of these elements contributed to the psychological impact that was the true purpose of the exercise. A body found too quickly might not have time to properly decompose, reducing the horror factor. A corpse discovered too late might be dismissed as just another underhive casualty, failing to deliver its intended message. But a death scene crafted with proper attention to detail could terrorize an entire sector for months, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the original target. The hunter had become a student of terror in ways that went beyond even the 8 legions' original training. He understood that different populations required different approaches. What would break the will of gang enforcers might have little effect on desperate refugees, while tactics that scattered criminal organizations might actually strengthen religious communities through shared adversity. The art lay in reading the psychological landscape of each target group and crafting an approach that would exploit their specific vulnerabilities. Over time, the hunter's reputation grew into something approaching mythology. Stories spread through the underhive's communication networks, not the official Vox channels that the authorities monitored, but the informal word-of-mouth system through which information truly traveled in places like Tertius Prime's depths. The details changed with each telling, growing more elaborate and more terrifying, but certain elements remained constant. The midnight blue armor, the skull-like face, the artistic arrangement of victims, and the absolute certainty that resistance was futile. These stories served the hunter's purposes perfectly. By allowing his reputation to grow beyond the bounds of factual accuracy, he multiplied his effectiveness exponentially. A single Night Lord could not be everywhere at once, could not personally threaten every potential troublemaker or criminal organization. But the fear of that Night Lord, properly cultivated and maintained, could be omnipresent. Gangs began to police themselves, rather than risk attracting his attention. Disputes that might once have erupted into open warfare were settled through negotiation or simply abandoned. The underhive's crime rate plummeted not through any improvement in moral standards, but through the simple calculation that certain activities were no longer worth the risk. But there was a price for this effectiveness, one that the hunter paid in increments so small that he barely noticed their accumulation. Each kill required him to descend deeper into the inhuman mindset that his transformation had created. Each successful terror campaign demanded more elaborate cruelties, more sophisticated psychological manipulations. What had begun as tactical terrorism gradually evolved into something approaching artistry, and from artistry into obsession. The need to create fear became an end in itself rather than a means to an end. The hunter began to experience what other Night Lords had reported: dreams that were more than dreams, visions that seemed to echo the prophetic madness that had consumed Konrad Curze in his final years. He saw himself reflected in the eyes of his victims, but not as they saw him as he truly was. a monster that had forgotten the human form it still wore, a predator that had transcended the species that had created it. These visions came with increasing frequency, accompanied by sensations that no Astartes should have been capable of experiencing: doubt, regret, and something that might once have been called conscience. The breaking point came, as such moments often do, without warning or preparation. The hunter had been tracking a new arrival to his territory, a small group of refugees fleeing gang violence in a distant sector. Intelligence suggested that they were carrying valuable information about Imperial Guard deployment schedules, making them potentially useful as either assets or examples. Standard protocol called for their capture and interrogation, followed by elimination once their intelligence value had been extracted. But when he finally cornered them in an abandoned hab block deep in the manufacturing sector, something unexpected happened. Among the adults cowering in the flickering emergency lighting, a child looked up at him with eyes that reflected not just terror, but recognition. Not recognition of who he was, but of what he represented: the darkness that children learn to fear before they have words for it, the monster that waits in the spaces between sleep and waking. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the hunter saw himself as that child saw him, and the vision was not of a weapon, or a tool, or an instrument of justice, but of something that had chosen to become the very thing that destroyed innocence. The chainsword in his hand felt suddenly alien, its familiar weight transformed into an accusation. The trophies that decorated his armor, skin stripped from victims, bones taken as mementos, symbols of his artistic achievements, became evidence of what he had allowed himself to become. Not a warrior, not even a monster in service to a higher purpose, but something that existed purely to create suffering. The child's terrified whimper cut through the mechanical wheeze of his breathing apparatus like a blade through ceramite, and for the first time in decades, the hunter hesitated. In that moment of hesitation, the full weight of his transformation became clear. He had not been shaped by the gene seed and hypno-conditioning into a better version of what he had been. He had been systematically stripped of every quality that might have made him worthy of the power he wielded. Courage had become cruelty, strength had become brutality, purpose had become obsession. And somewhere in the process, the child from Nostromo's streets had died so completely that even his ghost could not be found. But the moment passed, as such moments must in the grim darkness of the far future. The chainsword fell, not in mercy but in a kind of transcendence that went beyond human categories of good and evil. The refugees died as they were always going to die, but their death served a purpose that went beyond mere terror tactics. They marked the hunter's final abandonment of any pretense to justification, any claim to serve something greater than his own nature. He killed them not because they threatened the underhive's stability, not because their deaths would serve as examples, but because that was what he had been made to do. The transformation was complete. Where once there had been a warrior struggling with the darker implications of his calling, there now stood something that had made peace with its own monstrosity. The hunter no longer needed to justify his actions or rationalize his methods. He simply was, as a shark is, or a storm, or any other force of nature that destroys without malice and without regret. The philosophical questions that had once troubled him, whether terror could serve justice, whether cruelty could be noble, whether monsters could be righteous, became irrelevant. He was what the galaxy needed him to be, not a protector, not a savior, but a reminder that in the darkness between the stars, there were things that made the light precious by contrast. The aftermath of this transformation rippled through the underhive in ways that its inhabitants could not fully comprehend. Crime rates did not merely decrease, entire categories of antisocial behavior simply ceased to exist. Gang warfare became extinct not through negotiated settlements, but through the growing understanding that violence attracted attention from something that existed beyond human comprehension of threat or negotiation. Black market activities continued, but within increasingly narrow parameters defined not by law or tradition, but by an intuitive understanding of what would and would not be tolerated by the presence that haunted the deep tunnels. Other Night Lords began to take notice. Reports filtered through the scattered legions' communication networks of a brother who had achieved something approaching perfection in the application of their Primarch's teachings. Delegations arrived to observe his methods, to study his techniques, to learn from his example. What they found was both inspiring and disturbing: a Night Lord who had transcended the internal conflicts that plagued so many of their kind, but at a cost that even his brothers found difficult to comprehend. The hunter received these visitors with the courtesy due to fellow monsters, sharing his insights and techniques with the same dispassionate professionalism that he applied to his hunting activities. He demonstrated the proper arrangement of corpses for maximum psychological impact, explained the mathematics of fear propagation through closed social networks, and provided detailed analyses of the correlation between specific torture techniques and subsequent behavioral modifications in witness populations. These lessons were received with the reverence due to a master craftsman, and many of his visitors departed with new understanding of their calling's potential. But perhaps the most significant impact was not on his brothers or his victims, but on the broader Imperial ecosystem that surrounded his activities. The upper hive authorities gradually began to notice that their periodic concerns about underhive stability had simply vanished. Crime statistics showed not just improvement, but transformation, the kind of fundamental behavioral change that suggested evolution rather than mere enforcement. Social scientists who studied the data developed theories about natural criminal ecosystem development, publishing papers that praised Tertius Prime as a model for effective urban management without ever realizing the true nature of the force that had shaped their success story. The hunter had become something unique in the galaxy's long history, a monster whose monstrous nature served purposes that its creators had never intended, but that the galaxy desperately needed. He was proof that even the worst of humanity's creations could find their place in the cosmic order, that even the most damaged souls could serve functions that justified their existence. Not because they sought redemption or worked toward noble goals, but because they embraced their nature so completely that they became forces of nature themselves. In the deepest hours of Tertius Prime's artificial night cycle, when the underhive's population huddled in their improvised shelters and tried not to think about what moved through the passages beyond their meager lights, the hunter continued his work. Each death was still crafted with artistic precision, each display of terror calibrated for maximum psychological impact. But these were no longer the desperate actions of a warrior trying to justify his existence. They were the natural expressions of a creature that had found its perfect ecological niche. The galaxy is vast beyond human comprehension, filled with wonders and terrors that stretch the boundaries of imagination. In its spiral arms, civilizations rise and fall like waves on a cosmic shore, each believing itself to be the center of existence until the darkness claims it. Amidst this endless cycle of creation and destruction, the individual seems insignificant, a mote of consciousness flickering briefly before being extinguished by forces beyond its control or understanding. But occasionally, very rarely, an individual transcends the limitations of their origin to become something that shapes the galaxy rather than being shaped by it. Not through conquest or creation, not through acts of heroism or villainy as they are commonly understood, but through the perfect embodiment of what they were meant to be. The hunter achieved this transcendence not despite his monstrous nature, but because of it. In a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of fear, he became fear incarnate. In a civilization that had lost touch with consequences, he became consequence personified. The child from Nostramo's streets was long dead, consumed by transformation and purpose and the inexorable logic of what he had chosen to become. In his place stood something that wore the form of an Astartes, but thought with the cold clarity of a natural force. The hunter no longer remembered what it felt like to be human, because humanity was a luxury that the galaxy could not afford. Instead, he had become what the dark millennium truly needed, not a protector of the innocent, but a predator of the guilty, not a bearer of justice, but an instrument of consequence, not a light in the darkness, but a darkness so complete that it made the scattered lights precious by contrast. And in the end, perhaps that is enough. In a galaxy where hope is rationed and mercy is weakness, where the choice is often between different kinds of damnation rather than between good and evil, the hunter serves a purpose that transcends moral categories. He is the price that chaos pays for its freedom, the cost that cruelty extracts from the cruel, the reminder that even in the darkest places, there are depths that should not be explored, and boundaries that should not be crossed. The hunt continues. It will always continue. And somewhere in the darkness between the dying stars, a child who once ran through Nostramo's streets has become exactly what the galaxy needs him to be, not its savior, but its perfect predator, hunting in the shadows where the light of hope has never reached, and teaching the cosmos the most fundamental lesson of all, that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is always something worse waiting in the depths. 1 2 3 2 1